Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a really close look at, well, probably one of the most famous, certainly most researched, and maybe often the most misunderstood eating patterns out there. The Mediterranean diet, we all have this picture, right? Lots of veggies, some fish, maybe a drizzle of olive oil, probably eaten somewhere sunny. But our mission today is really for you, the listener, who needs the solid, evidence-based facts, not just the travel brochure version. We've gone through a stack of scientific reviews, historical deep dives, environmental reports. We're here to pull out the real scientific consensus, the actual components, and some of those surprising cultural and even environmental sides of the Mediterranean diet, or MD. We want to give you that quick but thorough understanding you need to grasp why this diet is still seen as, well, a kind of gold standard. Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. It feels a bit weird, but the whole idea of the Mediterranean diet, scientifically, it's actually pretty new, isn't it? Where did this concept even come from?
That's such a crucial starting point, because while the food itself has been around for ages, the concept, the defined Mediterranean diet, wasn't dreamt up in some village taverna. It was actually proposed much later, in 1975, by an American biologist, Ansel Keys, and his wife, Margaret Keys, who was a chemist.
American biologist, defining how people ate across the Mediterranean. That seems, well, that's quite a twist in the story of dietary science. What actually prompted them to formalize it like that?
Well, their work really stemmed from observations they made, maybe 15, 20 years earlier, back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, as part of that huge landmark Project Seven Countries study. They were looking really intensely at the eating habits, the traditional foods of specific groups, mainly in places like Greece, parts of Italy, and the Mediterranean coasts of France and Spain. They weren't trying to invent a diet. They were observing, seeing these patterns, and trying to link them to the frankly, remarkably better health outcomes they saw compared to, say, the U.S. at the time.
Okay, so if they were studying specific regional habits, we need to be super clear on the words we use here. The term Mediterranean diet, the MD we talk about today, that's more of a scientific blueprint, right? An eating pattern distilled from those studies.
Exactly. And it is absolutely not the same thing as Mediterranean cuisine. That's a huge umbrella term covering an incredibly diverse range of cooking traditions across dozens of countries. Think Morocco, Egypt, Turkey, the Balkans. These places have vastly different histories, cultures, religions, all influencing what's on the plate. The MD is the standardized model, the one derived from those initial observations of lower disease rates back in the 60s. It's not a snapshot of every single meal cooked across the entire region today, or even back then.
And the influence of that model, that blueprint, is pretty obvious when you look at how widely accepted it's become. It's not just some fad, it has serious backing from major health bodies.
Oh, absolutely. The fact that it's the most well-known and probably the most researched dietary pattern globally, that says a lot about how consistent the findings have been. The World Health Organization, the WHO, they recognize it as a healthy eating pattern. And importantly, right here in the U.S., the official dietary guidelines back in 2015-2020 recommended it as one of only 3 healthy diets, alongside DASH and a vegetarian approach.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's got international validation.
And all that institutional support, it really comes back to what got Keys interested in the first place. This idea of the Mediterranean paradox. That's kind of the hook, isn't it? What was so paradoxical about their diet back then?
Yeah, the paradox is all about the fat. You have to remember the context of the mid-20th century, especially in the U.S. Fat was, well, it was public enemy number 1 for heart disease. The guidelines were pushing for super low-fat everything. But Keys saw that in these specific Mediterranean spots, the ones they studied for the MD model, people historically ate a relatively high amount of fat, often somewhere between 25%, maybe up to 35% of their total daily calories came from fat.
That's a pretty hefty percentage, especially compared to what was being pushed at the time.
Exactly. So the paradox was high fat intake, yet generally a much, much lower rate of cardiovascular disease compared to countries eating similar or even less total fat, like the U.S. or Finland back then. It really threw a wrench into the idea that all fat was bad. It kicked off decades of research looking not just at how much fat, but crucially, the type of fat, the quality, and all the other things in their diet and lifestyle working together.
Okay, that sets the scene perfectly. We need to shift from this paradox idea to the actual nuts and bolts. When scientists talk about the MD today, the standardized pattern, what's actually on the plate? What are the core components?
Well, the scientific pattern gives us a pretty clear hierarchy, often shown as that famous pyramid, right? The biggest parts are at the bottom that tells you what to eat most often and in the largest quantities.
And right there at the base, it's just overwhelmingly plant-based, isn't it? Almost radically so, compared to a typical Western plate.
Radical for us? Maybe, but fundamental to the MD. High intake is the defining thing. We're talking unprocessed cereals, and that's key. Mostly whole grains, not white bread and pasta, plus lots of legumes, vegetables, and fresh fruits. Fruit is often the default dessert. Nuts and seeds are in there frequently too. These foods really dominate the daily intake by volume and how often you eat them.
What about animal products? They're usually front and center in modern diet talk. Where do they fit in the MD pyramid?
They're definitely further up in the moderate and low intake zones. So moderate intake includes fish and other seafood. The recommendation is usually at least twice a week. Dairy products, mostly lower fat things like cheese and yogurt, are in moderation, maybe daily or weekly depending on the guideline. Poultry and eggs also fit in that moderate sort of daily to weekly range.
And of course, the one element that always gets attention, often seen in those guidelines, the wine.
Yeah. Low to moderate consumption of red wine, but here's the key qualifier. Almost always with meals, not just drinking anytime. That really points to the whole social mealtime context of the diet, which is something we should definitely circle back to.
Okay, and just as critical as what you eat a lot of is what you don't eat much of. For someone coming from a standard Western diet, what are the big things they need to cut way back on?
Right. The low intake or avoid list is pretty strict, and it's where a lot of the change happens. We're talking red meat, processed meat, so sausages, deli meats, that kind of thing. Refined carbs like white bread and pastries, and sugary drinks and sweets. Now, zooming out, the overall fat content, like we said, is maybe 25% to 35% of calories. But, and this is crucial, the saturated fat is kept really low. At most, 8% of total calories. That low saturated fat number basically dictates a lot of the other food choices.
And that cap on saturated fat points straight at the single most iconic ingredient in the modern MD prescription, olive oil. It's almost a defining feature, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Olive oil is the principal source of fat. It carries the load for that 25–35% total fat intake. And the scientific community has been fascinated by it because it's packed with monounsaturated fats, especially oleic acid. The whole mechanism of the paradox, scientifically, often gets boiled down to that substitution effect.
Yeah.
Swapping out saturated animal fats for these monounsaturated fats from olive oil.
And the research on olive oil is so solid now that there are actually official health claims approved by the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. That's pretty rare for just a food item.
It is, yeah. It means there are specific, recognized benefits linked right to its chemistry. The polyphenols, those micronutrients in good olive oil, they have an approved claim for protecting blood lipids, your fats in the blood, from oxidative damage. And then there's the oleic acid claim, that replacing saturated fats with oleic acid helps maintain normal blood LDL cholesterol levels. Getting that level of official validation is a pretty big deal.
And if you needed more proof of how central olive oil is, there was that big 2014 meta-analysis, wasn't there? Linking higher olive oil intake to lower risks across the board.
Yeah, that was a landmark one.
Yeah.
It connected higher olive oil consumption with reduced risk of all-cause mortality, dying from anything. Basically, plus reduced risk of cardiovascular events and stroke. It really supports the idea of it acting like a protective shield.
It definitely paints the picture of the MD not just being about cutting calories, but about optimizing your fat intake, eating the right kind of fat and plenty of it.
Exactly. It dictates not just eating less bad fat, but eating the right kind of fat generously.
But okay, here's where our deep dive needs that nuance. We established the MD is a scientific pattern refined from studies, often looking back at a specific time. We've got to be careful not to mix this up with the much messier reality of historical Mediterranean cuisine, right? Keyes wasn't looking at every single cooking pot across the whole region.
That is absolutely critical to remember. If you actually look at how fats were used historically and regionally, this idea that the entire Mediterranean basin ran solely on rivers of olive oil, it just doesn't hold up. The defined MD model, the one we study, isn't perfectly typical of all traditional diets across that whole vast area.
Can you give us some examples of that variation? Because it helps people understand this is a synthesized ideal, not like a perfect historical record.
Sure. I mean, take northern and central Italy. Historically, especially away from the coast where it was colder, things like lard and butter were often the everyday cooking fats for savory dishes, partly because they were cheaper, easier to store maybe. Olive oil might have been seen as more high-end, maybe reserved for dressing salads or finishing vegetables.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That completely flips the modern script where olive oil is the go-to for cooking.
And it wasn't just Italy. If you go east and south, North Africa, the Middle East, the traditional staple fats were different again. You find cultures heavily using rendered butter, often called samna, or even things like sheep's tail fat in areas where olive trees maybe didn't grow well or weren't economical. These fats are definitely higher in saturated fat than olive oil. So those health benefits, Keyes first noticed, they must have come from more than just universal olive oil use. Probably the sheer amount of vegetables, the freshness, the overall lifestyle.
And this complexity, this variation, it shows up even when institutions try to pin down what moderate intake means in the MDT guidelines. Those serving sizes can vary quite a bit, which is, pretty important if you're trying to follow it closely.
Oh yeah, the variation shows how the basic pattern gets adapted.
Hmm.
Take dairy, for instance. The Mediterranean Diet Foundation might say aim for 2 servings a day. But then you look at the Old Ways guidelines, and they're looser. Moderate portions, daily to weekly. That's a huge practical difference. Are we talking a strict daily amount or just somewhere in a weekly range?
And the limits on red meat are obviously a key feature, but even how low intake gets defined isn't consistent, is it?
The differences there can be really striking. The general MD Foundation might say less than 2 servings of red meat per week. Okay. But then you look at the Greek dietary guidelines, which are based more closely on those populations Keyes originally studied, and they're way stricter. Only 4 servings per month. So if you're trying to really emulate the diet of those original long-lived groups, red meat becomes almost negligible.
That kind of restriction sounds theoretical unless we know what a serving actually is. Because let's be honest, modern serving sizes are often massive.
Right, we have to nail this down to make it real. A serving of meat in these guidelines is often defined as just 60 grams. That's about 2.1 ounces. Tiny compared to a typical steak or burger. A serving of bread, 25 grams. Cooked pasta, maybe 50 to 60 grams. A potato, 100 grams.
Okay, wait. 60 grams for meat. That makes the Greek guideline of 4 servings a month incredibly concrete. That's, what, 240 grams of red meat total for the entire month? That's barely half a pound.
Precisely. And that just hammers home the fundamental difference between the MD and a typical Western diet. This is a way of eating where vegetables, beans, whole grains are the main event. Animal protein, especially red meat, is really just a flavoring, a garnish, maybe a special occasion thing. Definitely not the daily centerpiece.
Okay, components established. Let's get to the core question. The science. Does this pattern, plants, olive oil, minimal red meat, actually deliver measurable health benefits? Let's start broad. All-cause mortality, just overall longevity.
The evidence here is, well, it's powerful. And it's been really consistent over decades of observational studies and reviews. Following the Mediterranean diet closely is strongly, consistently linked to a statistically significant drop in all-cause mortality. Simply put, people who eat this way tend to live longer, healthier lives.
And there was that 2018 review suggesting the impact isn't just personal health, it's bigger picture, even economic.
Absolutely. When enough people adopt the MD, the benefits start to scale up to public health levels. That review pointed out that widespread practice could improve a nation's overall health status by cutting down on those big non-infectious diseases, heart disease, diabetes, etc., which cost healthcare systems a fortune. And crucially, it suggested potential large-scale benefits, like lower living costs for individuals and significant savings for national healthcare budgets. It's almost like an investment in a healthier society.
Okay, now let's zoom in on the area that first got Ansel Keys hooked. Cardiovascular disease, CVD. This is really the traditional testing ground for the MD.
Yeah, and the consensus from major institutions here is pretty much unanimous. The MD is right at the top of the list of dietary patterns recommended to reduce CVD risk. You see strong endorsements from the American Heart Association, AHA, the American College of Cardiology, ACC, the UK's National Health Service, NHS. They all point to this diet as a key preventative strategy.
And wasn't there a very recent finding from 2023 highlighting a benefit for a specific group?
Yes, that review brought fresh evidence confirming a reduction in both mortality and CVD risk, specifically in women who follow an MD-style diet. While it's good for everyone, getting that kind of gender-specific data just helps reinforce its broad relevance.
And this is where we really need to dig deep. Despite those strong recommendations, there are some critical voices in the research world urging a bit of caution, specifically about the quality of some older evidence. This is really important for listeners to understand, right?
It's a necessary reality check, yeah. Some careful reviews between, say, 2016 and 2019. They raised some serious methodological questions. They argued that the evidence base, while huge for proving definitive causal prevention of CVD, was still, quote, limited and highly variable. We need to understand what that variability means.
So what kind of issues were they flagging? I mean, if the AHA is recommending it, what are the specific research concerns?
Often it boils down to the challenges inherent in studying nutrition. A lot of the studies are observational. You ask people what they eat and track their health. But self-reporting food intake, it's notoriously tricky and prone to errors. Plus, it's incredibly hard to isolate the effect of just one thing, like, is it just the oleic acid from olive oil? Or is it the high fiber? Or the lack of processed junk? Probably all of it, but proving that mechanism is tough. The 2019 Cochrane Review, which is known for being super rigorous, specifically mentioned uncertainty about the effects of just giving advice to follow an MD on actual CVD events and risk factors like blood pressure or cholesterol. They pointed to issues like lack of proper blinding in some trials.
So the tension is between, does it seem to work in the real world? Which, yeah, population studies strongly suggest it does, and can we prove exactly why and how it works with the highest level of scientific rigor? The correlation's strong, the causality mechanism needs more tightly controlled research.
Exactly. Researchers want to nail down, is olive oil the magic bullet? Or is it displacing the bad fats? Or is it the sheer volume of vegetables? It's likely the synergy, the whole package, but proving cause and effect in human diet studies is just incredibly complex.
Okay, moving beyond heart disease, what about metabolic health? Specifically type 2 diabetes. Is the picture clearer there?
Yes, actually. The evidence linking the MD to type 2 diabetes risk seems more consistently positive. Meta-analyses going back to 2014 and more recent reviews in 2017, they all pretty reliably found that sticking closely to the Mediterranean diet is associated with a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
And the big diabetes organizations reflect that clarity.
They do. The American Diabetes Association, ADA, for example, clearly recommends the Mediterranean diet as a healthy pattern to cut diabetes risk. This benefit is often chalked up to the high fiber content helping with blood sugar control and the lower overall glycemic load because you're eating fewer refined carbs and sugars. Clinical studies also show it helps manage risk factors for metabolic syndrome more broadly.
Okay, next up, cancer. We know diet plays a huge role in cancer prevention. How does the MD stack up specifically against cancer mortality?
Sticking to the MD shows a strong correlation with a lower risk of dying from cancer. And what's really interesting is seeing how the estimated effect has actually gotten stronger as research methods improve. An early meta-analysis back in 2008, it suggested following the diet closely was linked to about a 6% lower risk of dying from cancer.
And how has that number changed with better data over the last, 10, 15 years?
Well, an updated, broader review in 2021 found an even stronger link. It reported something like a 13% lower risk of cancer mortality in the general population associated with high adherence to the MD. It suggests the protective effects are real and maybe even more significant than we first thought as we get better at measuring adherence and controlling for other factors.
All right, finally, let's touch on brain health and weight management, two areas people are really focused on today. What's the verdict on cognitive function, maybe Alzheimer's risk?
The link here looks pretty promising. Observational studies consistently show that people who follow the MD more closely tend to have better cognitive performance overall, a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and seem to experience slower cognitive decline as they age. It certainly seems neuroprotective based on those associations.
But same caveats with heart disease, right? We have to be careful about jumping from correlation to causation with brain health, too.
Absolutely. That's the critical scientific footnote here. Despite that strong correlation, review after review stresses that we don't yet know for sure if the relationship is truly causal. Meaning, we know people eating this way tend to have healthier brains, but we haven't definitively proven that adopting the MD causes the improvement. It's hard to untangle it from the fact that people committed to this diet might also be more physically active, socially engaged, generally living healthier lifestyles, which also protect the brain.
And that same correlation-causation question comes up with mental health, too, specifically depression.
Same pattern, exactly. Observational studies link MD adherence to a lower risk of depression. But again, researchers are very clear. This does not prove that the diet itself prevents depression. It's so difficult to control for all the other lifestyle factors. Someone making the effort to follow the MD might also be exercising more, have stronger social connections, maybe better socioeconomic status. All things that protect against depression independently. The diet might just be one part of a bigger protective picture.
Which brings us naturally to weight management. Simple question. If you switch to the MD, are you likely to lose weight?
For people who are overweight or obese, the answer seems to be generally yes. Reviews suggest the Mediterranean diet can be effective for weight loss, mainly because it tends to lead to eating fewer total calories. You're swapping out those energy-dense processed foods for more filling, nutrient-dense options, while also boosting the overall nutritional quality of what you eat. Lots of fiber and water from fruits and veggies helps with satiety.
So it's less of a magic bullet weight loss diet and more of a sustainable way to eat fewer calories while getting better nutrition.
It's exactly. A 2016 review basically found it produced similar weight loss results compared to other well-known diets, like low-carb approaches. But where the MD really shines is combining that potential weight management with all those long-term chronic disease reduction benefits we've just been talking about. It's a unique package deal, really.
Okay, we've covered the science behind the food, but the picture isn't really complete if we just look at the nutrients, is it? We need to consider the bigger context, the culture, the environment, and even a surprising, maybe unintended consequence of its global fame.
That wider view is absolutely essential. The Mediterranean diet isn't just a list of foods, it's deeply embedded in culture. So much so that in 2010, UNESCO actually recognized the diet and its associated traditions as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. They call it the Mediterranean diet.
Wow, UNESCO recognition. That really elevates it beyond just nutrition, doesn't it? It confirms the benefit isn't purely chemical, it's social, it's behavioral. What kind of lifestyle habits get bundled into that?
Yeah, research often expands the definition beyond just food to include common lifestyle elements from the regions where it originated. Things like simple traditional cooking methods, yes, but also the incredibly important social aspect of eating meals together, communally. It can also include things like taking a post-lunch rest or nap, and crucially, integrating regular physical activity into daily life walking, maybe more manual work historically. These are often seen as working together with the food.
That communal meal thing feels really important and often lost in modern dieting. We're talking about a pattern where people traditionally sat down together, talked, slowed down. That's fundamentally different from grabbing a processed meal alone at your desk.
That social structure might actually support the physiological benefits. When you slow down, eat a varied plant-focused meal with others, you're changing your whole relationship with food, your stress levels, maybe even your digestion. It's all interconnected.
Okay, now for something unexpected, a medical observation that kind of highlights the complexities of taking a traditional diet global. You mentioned a gluten connection. How could a famously healthy diet contribute to a growing medical issue?
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? But it comes down to the diet's core staples. Because the traditional MD pattern includes a lot of gluten-containing foods, pasta, wheat breads, maybe barley lawway, the very fact that the diet has become so popular worldwide means the global consumption of these specific staples has unintentionally increased.
So, as more people globally adopt the MD, they're adopting a diet that happens to be quite rich in gluten, maybe more than they ate before, and this could be contributing to the rise in things like non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
That seems to be the thinking. The diet that promotes wellness might inadvertently be unmasking or exacerbating gluten-related issues in a wider population simply because it boosts the intake of its traditional gluten-containing staples on a global scale. It's a classic example of an unintended consequence when a regional food culture goes worldwide.
Fascinating. Okay, lastly, let's look at the environmental angle. These days, what we eat is also an environmental choice. Does the MD pattern fit with sustainability goals?
It does, actually, quite strongly. The basic structure of the Mediterranean diet seems to contribute significantly to better environmental and agricultural sustainability, and the reason really lies in where it places animal products on that pyramid quite low down.
You mean because it uses fewer resource-intensive foods?
Exactly. The MD inherently means lower consumption of dairy, ruminant meats like beef and lamb, and also ultra-processed foods. And those categories, they generally have the highest environmental footprint, land use, water, greenhouse gas emissions. The energy needed to produce meat, especially from ruminants, often massively outweighs the nutritional energy you get back.
Can we put a number on that benefit? How much difference could a wider adoption make?
The figures are pretty compelling. One life cycle analysis back in 2014 estimated that shifting towards a Mediterranean-style diet could cut food production emissions by around 30% per person compared to a typical omnivorous diet projected for 2050. It's not a small change. It's a significant step towards a more sustainable food system. It's like a health plan and an environmental plan rolled into one.
So this deep dive really confirms it. The Mediterranean diet isn't just some vague notion. It's a powerful, scientifically studied pattern carefully distilled from those positive observations Ansel Keys and his team made way back. It's fundamentally built on plants, whole grains, using olive oil as the main fat. And it's backed by really solid evidence for reducing risks of major chronic diseases,
Yeah.
heart disease, diabetes, even cancer.
It really is a blueprint for healthier longevity, supported by major health bodies worldwide. But, as we wrap up, we have to come back to that underlying tension we kept finding, that contrast between the traditional cultural roots and the modern simplified ingredient list.
Right. If the benefits were first seen in traditional settings back in the 50s and 60s, a time with far less processed food, more physical labor, way more communal eating, and if we also know that some traditional regional fats like lard or samna weren't always olive oil centric, well, that leads us to the final thought, doesn't it?
This is the really interesting question for you, the listener, to chew on. How much of the MD's amazing health track record comes purely from the specific ingredients we focus on today, the precise amount of oleic acid or polyphenols, versus how much comes simply from the absence of modern, ultra-processed Western foods, combined with the presence of those critical lifestyle factors, the daily activity, the social connection around meals, the slower pace? What part of that traditional context, beyond just the food chemistry, might be the truly essential element that's often missing when we try to adopt the diet today? Something to think about next time you gather around the table.